Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to talk about the further seizure of more Western assets and businesses that have been announced recently. The first group of assets that we're going to talk about relate to liquefied natural gas, the process of actually converting natural gas into a liquefied form so that you can then export it over the sea. And Russia, unfortunately, hasn't developed its own technology in this field. It's still reliant upon overseas companies to design, construct and implement these facilities. And as a result of its invasion of Ukraine, one of the major designers, a German firm called Linde, has pulled out of their contracts, and Russia has now seized assets of Linde and also some of the German banks that were supporting that transaction. So we'll go through the details on that. But one of the things that made me chuckle a little bit is that Linde is actually the German pronunciation of the word spelled Linde. But it got me thinking about who the most famous Lindes in the world are. And in a most recent poll, the top 5, I'm not sure whether you can guess who these people are. Number 5 is the American actress Linda Blair, whose most famous role was Reagan in the 1970s horror film The Exorcist. Number 4 is the Canadian supermodel Linda Evangelista. Number 3 is Linda McCartney, the American musician, photographer and vegetarian, who most famously was married to Paul McCartney of the Beatles. Number 2 is the American actress Linda Hamilton, most famous for her role as Sarah Connor in the Terminator movies. And the most famous Linda of all time, apparently according to this poll, is Linda Ronstadt, who topped the US Billboard charts with You're No Good in February 1975. So we'll go into the details as to what's happened to the German firm Linde and the 2 banks that were supporting it on the project, all of whom have now had their assets seized in Russia. We'll also talk about what's happened to another German firm, the business that produces the appliances branded BOSCH and SIEMENS, which has had its business seized in Russia, and also an Italian business that produces boilers, so water heaters, in homes, that also has had all of its assets taken away from it and given to GAZPROM. And then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think the implications of this ongoing seizure of Western assets is for the Russian economy, and what's going to happen in terms of the liquefied natural gas market from Russia's point of view, because this is a really important issue for Russia to get its head around, because it's got the largest gas reserves in the world. But unless it can convert that gas into a form that it can then export to countries like India, a lot of that gas is going to remain underground, and there's a real risk that Russia could lose the monetization of that valuable asset, as a lot of countries are now looking to move away from using gas. But before we get into all of that, I'd like to say once again, thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks recently, thank you for the time and effort you've taken to do that. Really, really appreciate it. And if you're a long-term supporter, either through Patreon, where you can get early access to my videos and also watch them advert-free, or you've signed up through Buy Me a Coffee membership or YouTube membership, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate that long-term support. Gives me a lot of motivation, makes me think up more videos and post as often as I can, so thanks. Linde is a German engineering business that was founded back in 1879 by Carl von Linde, who at that time was involved in refrigeration processes for the food and beverage industry. However, he soon moved on to focusing on trying to liquefy gases, and in 1895 he was granted a patent for the liquefaction of air. Now, Linde was involved in various projects throughout World War II with regards to Nazi Germany, but it now is one of the largest designers, constructors and implementers of liquefied natural gas plants in the world. And it's been working in Russia over the last 30 years, developing Russia's LNG facilities. And in 2021, it signed an agreement with a subsidiary of GAZPROM to build a brand new LNG plant in Ust-Luga. On March the 29th, 2021, around 11 months before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a 50% subsidiary of GAZPROM called Ruskim Allianz signed the deal with Linde to design, build and implement a liquefied natural gas facility with a capacity of 45 billion cubic meters per year, able to produce 13 million tonnes of liquefied natural gas per annum. Alongside its liquefied natural gas capabilities, the plant was also designed to produce ethane fraction, liquefied petroleum gases, and pentane-hexane fraction. A common feature of major international projects like this is that the parent company will require any business that is given a contract to provide guarantees in the event that that company goes bust. It wants to make sure that there will be enough capital to ensure that the project is completed. So alongside the deal that Linde signed, guarantees were also provided by two German banks, Deutsche Bank and Commerzbank. Now, as a direct result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Linde, alongside a lot of other companies from the West, decided that it no longer wanted to continue operating in Russia, and so it announced that it would not be completing the design and build of the LNG facility and that it was exiting Russia. As a direct result of Linde's exit from Russia, the GAZPROM subsidiary that it had signed the deal with to build the LNG facility announced that it was suing, and in January 2023 a Russian court ordered that Linde's Russian assets that were valued at $488 million be seized as a preventative measure. However, as the Russian business Ruskim Alliance was actually seeking $1 billion in damages against Linde, the seizure of these assets only represented around 50% of the claim. Ruskim Alliance then issued lawsuits against Deutsche Bank and Commerzbank for non-payment of 31 billion rubles, which is around $350 million, under the terms of the guarantees provided to Linde. Now, interestingly, in this case, both Deutsche and Commerzbank submitted an injunction to a London court to prevent the Russian lawsuits from progressing, and on October the 11th, 2023, it was announced that the London courts had ruled in favour of Deutsche and Commerzbank due to the fact that both banks were actually unable to pay Ruskim Alliance due to European Union sanctions. Both banks were granted an anti-suit injunction which prevented Ruskim Alliance from pursuing its case against the banks in Russia. However, despite this injunction being granted in London, on May the 18th, 2024, it was announced that a Russian court had ordered that Deutsche Bank and Commerzbank assets, accounts, property and shares be seized in Russia as part of the lawsuit raised against the banks relating to the Linde transaction. The St. Petersburg Arbitration Court has barred Deutsche Bank from exercising its 100% interest in the authorised capital of its Russian subsidiary, as well as Deutsche Bank Technology Centre LLC. The court has also imposed the seizure of up to 238.6 million euros, which is around $260 million, in securities, real estate and bank accounts of Deutsche Bank, as well as its Russian subsidiary and Deutsche Bank Technology Centre. The court also seized Commerzbank's assets worth 93.7 million euros, or around $102 million, as well as securities and the bank's building in central Moscow. So once again here we're seeing a situation where the Russian courts are completely disregarding what happens in the international courts. We had a situation where the German banks had both gone to the London court to seek an injunction against this lawsuit that had been submitted against them on the basis that the sanctions in place against Russia, the financial sanctions, prevented them from actually making any payments to Russia. So basically what they were saying was it was impossible for them to comply with the terms of those original guarantees, even if they wanted to, because the sanctions prevented them from doing so. And the London court ruled that that was correct, that the injunction would be in place and therefore the Russian courts could not legally proceed with the case against both banks. However, as we've just seen, the Russian courts completely ignored that. They went ahead, gave the ruling, and have now authorised the seizure of all of their assets in Russia. So what this tells us is that we've got an irreversible breakdown in terms of the relations between Russia and the West. When you get to a situation where the law courts of a particular country are not prepared to recognise international rulings, then that is obviously a major breakdown in terms of the way that country operates in conjunction with everybody else. Now, aside from the legal dispute and the seizure of assets, one of the things that I wanted to talk about in today's video is the implications of the withdrawal of Linde from Russia on the Russian LNG market, because Russia is sitting on the world's largest supplies of natural gas. It has over 24% of the total global reserves. So that should mean that Russia is making a huge amount of money because there's a large demand for natural gas. We've talked about it in previous videos, but one of the reasons why Europe and a lot of other countries have moved to using natural gas over the last 30 years is that it produces around 50% of the carbon dioxide produced by coal when you burn it to produce electricity. And so it's seen as a much cleaner fossil fuel. And so it was a lesser of two evils. And a lot of countries built huge power stations that feed off natural gas over the last 30 years, particularly in Germany and Italy, who are the two biggest buyers of Russian gas prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, since that invasion started, those countries have moved towards using liquefied natural gas because it's difficult to be able to set up the infrastructure for natural gas in a short space of time, because realistically the only way of doing it is to build pipelines. And there are some pipelines that exist in Europe. Norway, the UK and a few other countries do have natural gas fields, but to build these pipelines in order to replace the Russian gas would have taken a number of years. So the far easier and quicker route was to move towards using LNG, set up some terminals at the coast, and then feed that LNG into your existing network, and therefore everybody can continue using natural gas. But the problem that Russia has is that over the last 30 years, it really hasn't been developing its LNG capabilities. It's got a little bit complacent. It sat back and thought, we don't really need to spend all this money on LNG because we've got these pipelines that are supplying gas into Europe. We can just sit back and let the cash roll in. But obviously, because of what's happened, that's now not happening. They're not getting all of that money from Europe. And in order to monetize that gas that's sitting under the ground, they need to have these LNG plants, which can refrigerate the gas down to around minus 160 degrees centigrade under pressure, and then it can be shipped to countries like India, and Russia could start monetizing. But because it doesn't have that infrastructure, it's going to have to find people, firstly, to design, build and implement those plants, and secondly, to pay for them. Because in the past, the funding model that Russia was using was that it was relying upon its partner countries to pay for the majority of the infrastructure. So things like the Nord Stream pipeline were funded mostly by Germany because it was for their benefit, so they were happy to pay for that cost. But the problem Russia has now is firstly finding somebody who's happy to stump up tens of billions of dollars to actually pay for these LNG plants, and then secondly to design, build and implement them. And because these plants take 2 or 3 years at least to actually become operational, Russia is facing a huge lag now in terms of monetizing its natural gas. And this is going to represent a major issue for Russia over the next 5 to 10 years. And there is a genuine risk that by the time it does have these LNG facilities in place, that the world will have moved on, because there is a huge drive at the moment towards renewable energy. Rather than building more gas-powered stations, countries are building solar and wind and hydro, and even nuclear is seen as a preferable option. So there is a real risk here that Russia will end up leaving a lot of that gas under the ground forever. As we've discussed previously, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, many companies from the West who had facilities in Russia decided that they no longer wanted to carry on operating their businesses. So they withdrew their employees, their brands. Some of those businesses sold their companies to Russian counterparts for a massive discount. In many cases, they handed over the keys in exchange for €1, so just a token amount of money. And in other situations, their businesses were actually nationalized, so they were seized from them by the Russian state for reasons relating to security. Well, that was the official reason anyway. But what we saw was a huge exodus of companies and people leaving Russia forever. But some companies decided that they could get comfortable with the political issues and that they were happy to carry on trading as normal. And two of those businesses were an Italian business called ARISTON, which produces boilers for heating hot water and providing heating to homes, and a German business that produces the two brands BOSCH and SIEMENS, And both of these companies had factories near St. Petersburg. ARISTON had one that employs around 200 employees and was turning over around $100 million per year, so quite a big company. And BSH Hargrades had two factories near St. Petersburg that were producing fridges and washing machines. On April the 26th, 2024, it was announced that President Vladimir Putin had placed the Russian subsidiaries of Italian water heating company ARISTON and Germany appliance maker BSH Hargrades under the temporary management of a GAZPROM entity, in accordance with a new presidential decree. Now, interestingly, in this situation, there didn't appear to be any advance notice. There wasn't anything that the companies were provided with in terms of some sort of demand. There wasn't a deal that was going through. Neither of these businesses were in the process of trying to sell these entities, which has been the situation on some of the other businesses that have been nationalised, where companies have been trying to achieve a deal to strike some sort of exit, and then all of a sudden the company is nationalised. It's taken away from them, so they don't actually get any return at all on it. In this situation, it doesn't seem that either the Italian or the German business was trying to exit. They weren't trying to sell it. They didn't have any advance notice from Russia of any sort of news that this was going to happen. It just got announced. This decree was passed and these businesses were taken away from them. And when you look at what they're actually doing, one of them makes boilers, which is a commercial product that's sold into properties, and the other is making fridges and washing machines. So the decree that's been used to nationalise these businesses relates to things like national security, the deprivation of potential usage for Russian nationals. None of that really relates to these items. These are consumer products that you purchase on a regular basis. They're not something that are absolutely critical to the national security of Russia. And if you can't buy a BOSCH or a SIEMENS washing machine, then alternatively, you can just go and buy somebody else's. And it's interesting that both of these companies have actually reported problems over the last 2 years in terms of actually getting supplies, because they buy in components from all around the world. Some of those components have been restricted. They haven't actually been able to get all of the different parts that they need to construct the equipment that they're making. So it has actually reduced the output of those businesses. And you have to think that this act of nationalisation, actually cutting off the parent company, having no future relationship with either of them, is likely to make that situation worse, because any parts that were being provided internally within the group, things that were being moved either from Germany or Italy or elsewhere around the world that were owned by other subsidiaries, are likely to stop. So those companies are likely to find it more difficult to produce the finished goods, and this is going to impact on those companies further. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think what's happening with regards to the ongoing seizure of assets and the disregard of European and international laws is really quite interesting. And what we're seeing here is a further polarization of Russia. It's becoming even more isolated. So we start off by talking about the situation with regards to Linde, and I'm not talking about Linde Ronstadt, I'm talking about the German business that was designing and building the LNG plant for Russia. That deal was signed around 12 months before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and obviously the fact that the invasion took place meant that the German business decided that it was no longer tenable, it couldn't go through with that deal, and so it exited from the arrangement. But from Russia's point of view, obviously that left them in the lurch, because they need as much LNG as possible. So the last thing that they needed was one of their main partners, actually the company that was designing and building the plant, to walk away from the contract. So it's not surprising that Russia decided that they wanted to sue Linde, and it's not surprising that they ultimately seized all of their assets. And as we discussed earlier in the video, the value of those assets only relates to around 50% of the $1 billion that Linde is being sued for. So it's likely that Russia is going to come after them for more. And in relation to that, what they've done is turn to the two guarantors, the two German banks that signed in as part of that deal, Deutsche Bank and Commerzbank. They issued them with notice that they were taking them to court. Now, interestingly, both of those banks then turned to their legal teams and said, is there any way that we can avoid this? And they submitted a court injunction in London saying that technically, because they were never able to make the payments, it wasn't possible for them to actually complete the terms of that guarantee because of the financial sanctions in place against Russia. And that's quite a nice, neat loophole, a nice out for both of those banks. However, despite the fact that both of those injunctions were granted by the London courts, the Russian courts completely disregarded that. They ruled against both of the German banks, and their assets have now also been seized in Russia. So what we are seeing here is Russia is now creating its own legal system. It's not complying with international laws. It's not paying any attention to any rulings that are being given by international laws, and it's seizing assets from any company from the West that it deems as being unfriendly, that is in the interests of Russia to do so. So everybody involved in that transaction has lost a large amount of money. But when you take a step back and think about what's happening here, Russia is in a really difficult situation because it really needs to develop its LNG capability, because it's going to be really difficult to build more pipelines. It's currently in discussion with China about building a second gas pipeline to go alongside the power of Siberia. But that's going to take years to agree because it's a really big project. It's a long distance that it's trying to build over, and it's going to cost tens of billions of dollars. And China is unlikely to want to pay for that. And Russia at the moment is focusing a lot of its effort and a lot of its capital onto the war in Ukraine. So it doesn't really want to start building more pipelines that will take years to pay them back. So in order to try to export its gas, it needs to liquefy it, put it onto ships and sell it to countries like India. But in order to do that, it needs to build these plants. And all of the expertise for this is in the West. So the people who know how to do it, particularly in Russia, where they've got really cold environments, so it's difficult to be able to get these facilities to operate really efficiently. You need to get the best people in the world working on that, but the best people in the world don't want to work in Russia right now. And this is a major issue from Russia's point of view, because if they can't monetize that gas, if it gets left under the ground forever, then that's going to cause the Russian economy major problems because they're losing a huge amount of income. Now, the other issue that we've looked at in today's video is the seizure out of the blue, unexpectedly, of two businesses. One, an Italian subsidiary that was making boilers in Russia and has been operating for around 20 years. So this is a long-standing business. It's a brand that's familiar to Russian households. And the other is a German business producing fridges and washing machines under the BOSCH and SIEMENS brands. Now, I think what's interesting about this situation is that there wasn't any prior notice. Nobody really expected this to happen. There wasn't a build-up where Russia was threatening to do things, where these companies were saying that they were going to exit and leave all of their facilities abandoned. They've been continuing as normal. These companies have been operating for the last 2 years or so as if nothing happened. There have been some operational issues that we talked about in the video with regards to supplying some of the components. But generally speaking, these companies were operating as if the war in Ukraine had never actually started. So it is quite surprising. And I think what we're seeing here is Russia flexing its muscles to show the West that even if your businesses want to carry on trading in Russia, even if you're quite happy with the commercial agreements, we can do whatever we like. So there is a major threat hanging over any business that has carried on trading in Russia, that at some point there could be a knock at the door and the authorities turn up and say, we have now decided to take control of your business. You don't get any compensation. You won't get any future revenue. It now becomes nationalized. And I guess what this does is send a message to any company that isn't Russian or isn't from a friendly nation that there is a possibility that your business could be taken away from you at any moment without any notice whatsoever. And obviously, from a commercial point of view, that doesn't really make any sense, because you would have thought that Russia would be looking after the businesses that are carrying on as they were. They need as many companies as possible to contribute to the Russian economy, because the more profit that those companies make, the more tax that they pay, the more their employees are paid and they can then spend in the local economy. All of that is good for the Russian economy. Seizing businesses, changing control, potentially changing the supply chains and finding it difficult to get some of the parts doesn't make any sense at all, because that's going to throw those companies into disarray. They're likely to produce less. Potentially some of the employees may decide that they want to leave because of this change of ownership. We don't know how it's actually going to work on a day-to-day basis. So all of this seems like a crazy decision that doesn't make any sense, apart from Russia wanting to send a message to both Italy and Germany that it's in control and it can do what it likes. So the overall summary of today's video is that the asset seizures in Russia, the nationalization of assets, is continuing, and it's likely that we'll see a continuation of this process over the next 12 to 18 months until there is nothing left. I think most companies that have assets in Russia, if they haven't already written them off, they will be at some point in the near future. They'll be writing down that value to zero because it's unlikely that they'll remain on your ownership forever and ever. At some point, Russia may decide that it wants to step in, take full control of those assets, and it will do that. And even if the international courts say that it's not lawful for them to do that, the Russian courts will ignore that. Russia will pass some new decrees deciding what it wants to do. It's creating its own law, its own environment. But long term, this is bad news for the Russian economy. Certainly from the liquefied natural gas perspective, Russia needs help. It needs some partners to come in, help it to build those facilities, to get that gas and convert it into LNG, whilst everybody actually still wants to buy gas, because at some point in the future, demand will start falling for LNG. But Russia has decided it doesn't care about any of that. It's cutting all of its ties, it's seizing assets, it's killing its own businesses, and this is all bad news for the Russian economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.